before we continue on the retreat, I just want to mention something that I neglected to mention last night, that very often when we're on retreat, and many of you would know this already, but when we're on retreat, because we're living together and we're in silence, because we're trying to listen to the sounds within, and often there's a lot of noise going on inside, and God is also trying to speak in all of that, so that as we know our heart better. But because we're living together, can be a sense of expectation that we've got to greet each other as we're walking past in the corridor. And I just want you to ignore each other. Now, not out of rudeness, but out of a sense of being absorbed in the moment, being attentive to your heart. We're trying to enter into a journey into our own hearts where God dwells. And so, yes, obviously if you see someone in need, then by all means go out and help them. I'm not encouraging you to be uncharitable or unkind, but I'm encouraging you to be very much attentive at each moment. Apply all your energies to listening, and that means necessarily disengaging in some way from the normal things that we do, so that we can listen with all that sensitivity that is necessary at times to listen to those subtle whispers of God. So if you're walking past another sister in the corridor, don't feel that you've got to greet her. It's not bad manners on this retreat to just walk past, look away. You remain in your own thoughts. Trust me, it'll feel a bit unnatural in the beginning because you're all so accustomed to doing it, but it's actually a good thing to just keep going. We're all on the retreat together. So as we continue our journey to the heart, I thought there's no, certainly one of the better ways of doing this is to actually look at the different hearts that the scriptures give to us. We always turn to the scriptures as the inspired word of God, and so we want to, in fact, look at different examples in the scriptures, because as we consider the various stories, we not only are engaged within the story, but hopefully we'll find certain elements of that story are also true of us. So our purpose isn't so much to do an exegesis or break down the Hebrew or the Greek. That's for another purpose or another time. Our time on retreat is to listen to the word, to see what the sacred writers have presented to us, and then to hear what is also true very much about us. So the first story that we want to look at, or the heart, is the heart of Abraham. In the liturgy, I think it's the first Eucharistic prayer, we call him Abraham, our father in faith. Because Abraham was really the first one that we know of that really began to trust God profoundly. In Abraham's life, we see very much a life of faith. And I know some of you might be thinking, well, what about Adam? Didn't Adam have to live in faith? Yes, he did, certainly. Adam and Eve had a privileged experience of God before the original sin, whatever that ended up being. But we also have the figure of Noah. Now there's already sin in the world, and Noah certainly learned to live in trust. But Abraham, in a new way altogether. Abraham was called from Ur of the Chaldees, and this is what God says to Abraham. Yahweh said to Abraham in the book of Genesis chapter 12, "Leave your country, your kindred, and your father's house, for a country which I shall show you. And I shall make you a great nation. I shall bless you and make your name famous. You are to be a blessing. I shall bless those who bless you. I shall curse those who curse you. And all clans on earth will bless themselves by you. That's a pretty amazing promise that God makes to Abraham, or at this stage to Abram. I'm already jumping ahead of his story. His name hasn't changed yet, but we will come to what that means later on. We keep in mind at this moment that Abram is 75 years old. How many of us are going to start a whole new life at the age of 75? We're looking for retirement, thank you, or happily in it already. And I know we're religious and priests and we don't retire from, there's no vacation from a vocation, they used to say, and it's absolutely true. But the fact is, God is asking him to shift country, not just to go to a different neighborhood, not go to a retirement village or something else, shifting country. Leave your country, your kindred, say your family, all the people that you know and love and have had contact with, and your father's house for a country which I shall show you. Hang on, you're not going to tell me what that country is, God? So here is Abram trusting in God, whom he cannot see, who doesn't tell him exactly what is going to happen. I mean, he does give him a lot actually, but he leaves a lot of blank spaces. And so what does this tell us about Abram? Abram is a great man, extraordinary man, an extraordinary faith. And what we will see in each of these stories is certainly the quality of faith. But Abram encapsulates it in a profound way, and really in a way unlike anyone else that has gone on before him. Faith, of course, means to believe in things that we cannot see. To believe in things that we cannot see. And in the letter to the Hebrews, the sacred writer that for many centuries, anyway, certainly was believed to be St. Paul. It's very much the Pauline kind of thinking. But he goes through a whole list of Old Testament characters, and it's all about faith. And some of the characters are very noble, and some of them are not exactly very noble. I mean, we're talking about Rahab, the prostitute who was saved, but she too had faith, and she obviously became an Israelite. And anyway, so the sacred writer there of the letter to the Hebrews goes through and names them all, but Abraham is key amongst them. So the kind of heart that Abram had is a trusting heart. He was able to, being sure that God is actually saying this to him, he was able to step out and say, okay, I'm going to do that. Now that took a lot of other virtues as well, not just faith. It took courage. I mean, Abram didn't have a heart made of stone. It must have been difficult for him to leave his country. Can you imagine? He's 75 years of age. Abram, by the way, lives till he's 175. So you might say his life is just starting out, But, so he still had 100 years left, but he doesn't know that. Just like we don't know how many years we've got left. Some more, some less. But that's the invitation. And faith is always faith in someone. It's faith in someone, not in something. We believe certain things by faith, but it's because someone has revealed them to us. Of course, supernatural faith means God has revealed them to us with his authority, and because he knows all things and loves us and can never be deceived. God, when he speaks with absolute clarity, and everything that he says can be trusted. Once understood correctly, then we can go with absolute blind faith, you might say. Remember what I just said to you. once understood correctly. Because God does make promises, but as we will see later on with Abram, he understands, but he also doesn't understand. As the Italians like to say, they have an expression, chiaro scuro, clear and dark, light and shadow. Faith operates like this. So Abram leaves, and what happens? He takes Lot with him. He was 75 years old when he left Haran, and he took his wife Sarah and all his possessions that he amassed and the people they had acquired in Haran. So God had told him, leave your country, your kindred, and your father's house. So leave your family behind and your father's house. But what do we just hear in the next few verses? That he took Lot, his nephew. Question for you. Isn't Lot one of his family? His nephew? Absolutely. Didn't God just tell him, leave your family behind, your kindred? Yes, he did. So why is he taking his nephew? Good question. It's an insurance policy. Yeah, in case God's promise doesn't come about, at least I'll have somebody to inherit me, right? I mean, I'm putting it in human terms, okay? But, so what it says about Abram, he was a great man, great enough to listen to God and to move forward and to take those important steps to leave. But his faith has not yet reached perfection. Okay, so that's what it says. Now, that's good, because I hope here we're starting to see ourselves. Some days we're greatly trusting in God and we feel so full of faith and we would say yes to anything he asks. And other days, because of whatever's happening, maybe our health is getting us down, maybe we are overweighted by whatever concerns, our anxiety is playing up, whatever it happens to be, overwhelmed with studies, our faith might be only hanging on by a thread. And that's okay, because we're still trusting. So Abram believes, but we have a little hint there that his faith is not yet perfect. Excuse me. Now we have a strange episode in Abram's life where he goes to Egypt. Great. And he's there for a time, and since there's a famine in the country, it was severe. So when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, Sarai in Hebrew means princess, or queen, princess more so. And Avram means dad is greater, or exalted father. Dad is greater. And the prerogative to name the children in Semitic culture belongs to the father. So Abram's father would have named him, and he's very proud to have a son, but he names his son, Dad is exalted, Dad is greater. So just keep this in mind. When little Abram was a boy and he's playing with the other boys at school, or playing soccer or marbles or whatever they played in those days, so what's your name? Dad is greater. Dad is greater. Oh, your name is Dad's greater. Oh. So as they're looking at Abram, the pointer is always leading towards his father. So we'll see what happens later on. So this strange episode now happens in Egypt. And this is what Abram tells his wife Sarah. Look, I know you are a beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, that is his wife, and they will kill me, but leave you alive. Therefore, please tell them you are my sister, so that they may treat me well because of you, and spare my life out of regard for you. Hang on a minute. If they're going to kill me because you are my wife, why should they respect me because you are my sister. Well, anyway, kind of a strange logic that somehow, well, okay, she's very beautiful, but if she's his sister, well, we'll treat her nicely as long as we can have her as, as a wife, as a sexual object in some way. And but if it's his wife, then we have to kill him because. So it's screwy thinking by our own day. But what does it say about Abram as well? That his way of acting, apart from being strange, is also confusing and doesn't show always the same virtue, right? He's quite willing to mislead in order to achieve some kind of end, a good end, hopefully. Well, not hopefully, a good end. And we see, though, this is another aspect of his heart, that he's not willing to be upfront. We know that in those times it's a very cutthroat kind of existence. Might is right and so forth. You might say nothing's changed really, but anyway, I'd like to think there's some development that has certainly taken place in our own times, notwithstanding a lot of brutality that's still around, not least of which the killing of little children in abortion. But it just shows about Abram's heart that there's a confusion there too. So he's not always a man who thought in terms of, just because he's received this great call from God, that therefore everything is all clear and upright about the way he acted. I want you to think of yourselves. This is just to help put it into context. We pray, we practice a virtuous life insofar as we can, and as much as we can. But sometimes, out of the blue, we find ourselves making the odd decision or comment that is out of character, is strange. You think, where did that come from? That is indicating that there's a little corner of my being that makes the decision. And remember, the heart that we're talking about here is the heart in Scripture, that that affection, so the feelings and the mind and the will coincide, that deep place within us where we make the decisions, and that is truly who we are. This is it. We see that in Abram, there's elements there that are quirky. Then we move on to the next part of the story of Abram. Abram and Lot arrive to the Negev. And what happens? Well, Abram had lots of, we've heard this reading in the daily readings of the Mass. We hear that there's a dispute, not between Abram and his nephew Lot, but between their workers. And there's the land that is not big enough to house all the flocks, to be able to look at them properly. So a dispute breaks out, and what we see, Abram's a big man, big-hearted man. He says to Lot, you take the left-hand side, I'll take the right, or the east. You take the west, I'll take the east. You take the east, I'll take the west. In other words, you go wherever you like. And what this again reveals about Abram is that he was a real family man. Although he loved Lot and cared for him, he was his nephew, he brought him with him from another country, he didn't want to have any ill will, any fighting. And this, I hope, at least springs up somewhere in the back of our mind, the understanding of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Of course, we're racing ahead there. So that's how Abram then, Abram discovers or settles disputes. In other words, he's not someone who is just standing up and down for his own rights, or he's so self-absorbed. Then there's another episode that happens in Abram's life. So His name hasn't changed yet, remember? And what happens? Well, there was a war going on, and eventually in the war, his nephew Lot rather, gets picked up and kidnapped. And Abram realizes this and thinks, well, what am I going to do? He gets all his men together, 318 of them, and he goes and takes on the 5 Amorite kings. And he wins and brings Lot back. So, although, again, is further love and another insight into his heart, he didn't harbour grudges. You know, he could have been, any other human being could have been very, bitter towards Lot, to his nephew, thinking, you know what, I brought you all this way, now you're separating from me, and, they may have thought that if you are, if you're kidnapped, well, that's your fault. I'm not going to put my life in danger to do that. But Abram goes and rescues his nephew, and wins. He's victorious, and he brings him back. What we also see playing out here as we look at the heart of Abram, we also see that the blessing of God is playing out in his life. Okay? This is what one of the things that the sacred writer in the book of Genesis is trying to tell us about. So anyway, they come back and they bring all the goods and everything back, and brings Lot as well. On their way back, they meet a mysterious character, Melchizedek. And we hear his name mentioned in the first Eucharistic prayer. And there's an explanation about who Melchizedek is. It's a mysterious figure with no lineage, and he, in the letter to the Hebrews, he was Melech, or king of righteousness, and king of peace, Salem. And Abram pays 1/10 of everything that he wins or gains. So he tithes. And tithing wasn't actually part of the law there. There's something that's actually all coming when eventually we have the law is given to Moses. Abram lived around 1850 BC, whereas Moses, we're looking about 1250 BC. So there's a 600-year difference there going on. And he pays the tithes to Melchizedek. Some have put various theories forward who Melchizedek was. He was a priest. He offered bread and wine. Sounds familiar, like someone else is going to do a few thousand years later. The Lord Jesus himself sacrifices bread and wine. But then we come to chapter 15. And Abram now has been faithful for some time. Sometime later, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and shall give you a very great reward. Lord Yahweh, Abram replied, what use are your gifts, as I am going on my way childless, since you have given me no offspring? Abram continued, a member of my household will be my heir. Then Yahweh's word came to him in reply, such a one will not be your heir. No, your heir will be the issue of your own body. Then taking him outside, so before we go into that, so we see that Abram, although he's been faithful, he's been victorious, he's gained lots of possessions, he's able to bring back his nephew Lot, takes on 5 Amorite kings and their armies with just 318 men, and is victorious. God's blessing is behind him. But Abram doesn't quite see it yet, because he's 75. Well, he's now more than 75, probably 80, 85. And he's thinking, God's promised me a son. I haven't got one. Is God really keeping his promise? So he's starting to question. And God has to come and reassure him. And this is also okay too, because we have our moments when in our hearts we may not doubt in the theoretical sense, but experientially. And this is how we live and sense faith, right? The life of faith. We experientially think, okay, God, are you near me? Are you really watching over me? I know you are protecting me, but sometimes it feels that you're so far away, and you know I'm suffering right now, or going through some difficulty, and I'd really love to have something from you, but it seems like you're hiding your face from me. So there's a moment like this for Abram. And so God has to reassure him. So then he takes him outside. He says, look up at the sky and count the stars if you can. Just so will your descendants be, he told him. Abram put his faith in Yahweh, and this was reckoned to him as uprightness. What happened at that moment? Obviously, Abram's faith was beginning to feel weak, to waver. He needed reassurance. It's like someone does to us when we're feeling emotionally vulnerable, and they'll grab us by the arms. Don't worry. They put their arm around us and they give us a hug. It's okay. You're going to get through this. You're going to get through. Doesn't feel right, but you're going to get through. And we receive that strength, you know. That's what God has just done for Abram. But then he says, go outside and count the number of the stars. So we imagine, he's outside and he starts to count the stars. Have you ever tried counting stars? As a child, maybe. You can admit to it, okay? I tried to do it, many times. I didn't succeed. And I started counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I got to 100 once, and then you get confused and your eyes get blurry. Well, that's not what was going on. Because we look further on in the passage. He says, okay. Then he said to him, I am Yahweh who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this country as your possession. Lord Yahweh, Abram replied, how can I know that I shall possess it? And now he says, bring sacrifice to me. Sacrifice. And what's going to go on here is there's going to be a covenant between God and Abram. God and Abram. And then we told a few verses later, now as the sun was on the point of setting, a trance fell on Abram, and a deep dark dread descended on him. In other words, God had taken Abram outside to count the number of the stars, if you can, during broad daylight, not at night. How can we count the stars during the day? We can't, because there's a big light bulb in the sky, we call the sun. At that time, Abram didn't know that the sun itself was another star. It just happens to be the closest star to the earth. So, but Abram knew that behind the sun, when the sun goes away, there's all these stars there. So this is an image of faith. Believing without seeing. Just as you believe and know that there are stars behind the sun, so too, trust me that I know you will have a son, even though you cannot see it right now. And then eventually God makes the sacrifice or the covenant with Abram, and Abram believes at that moment. He reassures, says, okay God, I trust you. I trust you. So a very trusting heart. Then eventually, we fast forward a bit, the fulfillment of the promise comes about. And Abram, well, firstly though, there's another error comes in, that Sarah, his wife, provides him with the slave girl. Hagar. It says, oh, maybe Abram, God will give you children through the slave girl. And Abram knows better. He knows better, but he plays along with his wife's silly suggestion. And it was a stupid suggestion, but he plays along with it. So it says something too about his character, that there's a weakness in his heart there. He's not always ready to stand up for right or wrong, particularly when it comes to his wife. And there's lots of husbands like this, who should be standing up to their wives, and they don't, for whatever reason, usually just to keep the peace. But there's certain things, and we see that there are consequences that come from this. Then what happens? Hagar conceives, Ishmael is born, and now Hagar thinks, I have a son, you don't, and says to Sarah, so now Sarah is really upset. Said, what do you expect me to do, woman? You start this, and she says to him, this is all your fault, may God judge between you and me. And so now she's calling God as the judge. You see that a court, she's having a little court session there between her. Okay, okay, treat her as you will, so he allows her then to beat her and so forth, and so Hagar runs away. Well, you see, that's the cowardice. Abram should have stood up for the right things in the beginning, and then these other consequences wouldn't have come about. But then because he was weak and did the wrong decision in the beginning, it required him then to be weak again, or he was still weak, and continued the consequences, allowed her to beat her. So no, you can't. It's also my son now. And so what it reveals is that his heart was weak like the rest of us, and he also made mistakes, and not one or two, but quite a few, Then God makes another promise with Abram after Ishmael was born, and he then promises him through the custom of circumcision. And circumcision, you think, what is this all about? God has got a morbid sense of humor in saying to Abram, you are to circumcise yourself, and you're to circumcise every male in your household. It's not. It's actually God's way, very concretely, telling Abram that every time you love your wife, this could be the moment when I will grant you your son. I will keep my promise. So there's a promise in his heart. He's now 99 years old. How old was he when he received the promise? 75. So 24 years have passed. He's 100 when his son Isaac is actually born. So for 25 years he keeps this promise in his heart. His faith is sometimes strong, sometimes weak. So these are the shades of colour in the heart of Abram. And then eventually, at the age of 100, his son Isaac is born. Now Isaac and his wife is 90, Sarah, at that moment. And this is now where we hear the name, just before that, at the circumcision, the name change happens. For my part, this is my covenant with you, chapter 17. You will become the father of many nations, and you are no longer to be called Abram. Your name is to be Abraham, for I am making you father of many nations. We see now the name Abram meant exalted father, or dad is greater. And God, in renaming Abram to Abraham, so from God, dad is greater, exalted father, to father of a great multitude, God has taken Abraham out of the shadow of his father, and he's given him an identity all of his own. And which is a beautiful thing. And this happens just 1 year before Isaac is born. So not only does God keep his promise to Abraham, but he also gives him an identity change. Now, and can you imagine how hard it must have been for Abraham to constantly be in the shadow of his father, growing up, and this is now for 100 years of his life. And we see this actually playing out. We see many families where parents are living vicariously through the lives of their children. They tell their children that they're free to do whatever they like, but the moment children do something or study something or choose a career that they don't want to do, or lo and behold, become a religious or a priest, and the parents may not be very religious, and they will frown on it. So you see that parents sometimes who say they love their children don't really love or respect them. But anyway, so Abraham has been taken from this now, and he is freed and promised as a father of a great multitude. And then eventually Isaac is born a year later. And Isaac in Hebrew means laughter or joy. So he is a cause of joy for Abraham and for Sarah. But there's also a nice little twist that happens here, that 1 year before the birth of Isaac, the three men who are a figure of God come to appear to Abraham in the heat of the day. And in the heat of the day, nobody would visit anybody else. You'd visit them at sunrise or at sunset, because it's just too hot. You're inside your tent to avoid the... So this must be something unusual. But again, Abraham's heart, ever faithful. So notice, although morally he's weak, he won't make the right decisions, he won't stand up to his wife, but he's courageous when he goes to defend his nephew. But when it comes to God and trusting, although sometimes his faith is weaker, he's always open to hear what God has to say to him. So he's receptive to a stranger in the middle of the day. He's in his tent normally, but he comes out to meet God. So this is another beautiful aspect, and I want to keep bringing this out, of the heart of Abraham, because he is truly our father in faith. But from a distance, Sarah is hearing this prophecy of the three men. A year from now, your wife will have a baby boy in her arms. And so Sarah overhears this, and she she laughs. And then they turn to her and say, "Why did you laugh?" "Oh no, I didn't laugh. I didn't laugh." You know. "Oh yes, you did. We know. We caught you. You know. We'll play it again on camera. You know." But it's so in the end, here is Sarah. Isaac is born now. Abraham names him. She's breastfeeding him, holding him in her arms, and she's looking at laughter. And she must have thought of her own laughter, doubting that God could do this, because she's now 90 years old and her husband's 100. But God keeps his promises. So God always has the last laugh. Always, because he told Abraham, you know, you name him laughter and joy, and he will bring you joy. And so there's that little twist going on there as well. And then one final thing really about Abraham's story that gives us Abraham's heart in a beautiful way is God is testing Abraham with the greatest test of his life. And this is where faith now comes to absolute perfection in him. God had just told earlier that through Isaac is the one through whom your name will be carried on. He'd already told him that. And now he's asking him to sacrifice him. And we all know the story, right? It's a beautiful story. But again, Scripture doesn't talk anything about the feelings going on through Abraham at that moment. We have to supply them, right? That's part of the meditation process, that we've got to supply this. So the sacred writer is giving us the basic story, but we've got to go through it. So can you imagine Abraham now, who must have felt a real love for his nephew Lot, to go and take on the 5 Amorite kings and win with 318 men. How much more must he now have strong feelings for his son? And he'd waited 25 years for his son to be born, and now God says, you must sacrifice him. Right? The tearing inside of him. So Abraham's heart must have been very confused at this moment. Well, in one sense, clearly he understood God wanted him to sacrifice his son. He also knew that God said, it's through Isaac that your offspring will come about. Your line will be continued. So therefore he also believed and trusted, and must have trusted, that God could even raise Isaac from the dead. Otherwise it doesn't make sense. It's through Isaac that is through whom your name will be carried on. Okay, now go and sacrifice him for me. Hang on, God, didn't you just say it's through Isaac? Yes, I did. And you wouldn't blame poor Abraham if he thought, is God changing his mind? Is God playing games with me? Well, no, because by this stage, God had already proven himself to Abraham so many times, and he wanted to bring his faith to perfection. And we know what happens, and but those 3 days journey, and eventually, so the tearing, can you imagine every time he would have looked at his son, who was probably, 12, 13, 14 years of age, he ties him up, so he must have been old enough or big enough to probably want to resist, right, when he's about to be killed. So he has to tie him up, and every time he would have looked at his son as they're walking to go to the mountain, he would have wanted to break into tears, because he knows what he's about to do. And God doesn't tell him, don't worry mate, I'm going to rescue you. It's just a test, right? No. God, if God tells us that, then there's no, we don't grow in faith, right? That sense of abandonment and complete trust wouldn't happen. And so eventually we know the story, and God says, now I know you fear God. You put me above everything else that you held most precious and dear. And that's why faith at that moment ends up being truly perfected in the person of Abraham. So as we wind up the meditation for this morning, we see that Abraham's heart has many shades within it. Morally, sometimes he's weak, didn't stand up for the right thing. He was a real family man. Go and take on the enemies to rescue his nephew Lot. But above all, he was a trusting man, trusted God so much that he would go to another country, leave most of his family behind in order to keep walking the journey. And you all have left countries behind. You've trusted that God is actually speaking to you. And you've seen that this has been confirmed by the events that have happened in your life. Sometimes you understood them, sometimes only maybe years later did you understand God's purpose. But God is being faithful to you as he was to Abraham.